John, I will note it's time, but also that Hank is not in the room, just as a
Right, let's chase him down. I mean, technically, he has like 5 to 10 minutes, I suppose.
you typing, John?
Yes. Oh, is that? I'll deal with my microphone situation.
All right, I think we need to raise a fund to replace John's mechanical keyboard with.
I just spent a lot of money replacing this. This is 2 days old. This is what 1980s style IBM is my thing.
I have one of those that my wife won't let me use. All right, we're killing time. Waiting. I guess we should start without Hank.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Oh, it's going to be a bad meeting if we don't get someone willing to take notes. So I did one round of asking. Anybody willing to jump into hedge doc and just kind of capture the highlights? I don't need a blow by blow. I don't think anyone needs a blow by blow. All right, come on, somebody take notes for us. I'm gonna make chairs unhappy. All right, we're gonna. Nicole's gonna, and I know that that's not going. You have some stage time. That's perfectly fine. I will appreciate any help we get in notes. We're gonna move forward. I'm gonna hand off to you, John, and tell you not to type. Sorry. I can handle the next two slides. I will say thank you to my co-chair for doing all the slide work. This is the note well. You may have seen this at this point, but it's Tuesday, so maybe not. Good work, Hank. You've made it in for time for the note well. This is the, I'm not supposed to explain this to you. I'm supposed to give you time to read this. Yeah, I didn't read the blurb I'm supposed to read. So,
well, so the important thing, given that it is also Tuesday morning, so we're not as deep into the meeting as we often are. The important thing for folks here is to realize this is a new slide and a slightly new formulation. So we used to have the note well and the note very well, for no very good reason other than one is kind of about how you work and the other is how you conduct yourself. We have kind of combined those now, so do take a moment to just read this and make sure that you see all the references, because yeah, it's the intent obviously is consistent with what you've seen before, but the substance is slightly different, so do take a refresh.
Yes, and there the intellectual property rights and the statements there are a little bit newer than they're not updates for this IETF, but they are a little bit newer on the slide. Meeting tips. This is being recorded. This should not be a surprise to anyone. It's there for everyone. Okay. Hand it off to you, John.
Yep, thank you. So, so we've had our welcome. I put a welcome in the chat too. We've got a moment for agenda bashing. I just wanted to check in with Amory that you and Nicole are going to share that slot now. We don't need to bash the agenda more than that. Great. So we'll do that. And Dick unfortunately can't be with us today. So we had a chat and we thought it's still important to present this because the OCP and the FDA labels serve as a useful backdrop to thinking about last feedback and more input on Scrappy and things. So we thought it was worth presenting anyway. So I'm going to stand in as a stunt Dick and just run through his slides as best I can. But of course, any questions or follow up or things, they can happen on the mailing list afterwards. So a little bit of agenda bashing. But any other major changes, or should we get started with Hank? Looks like we're good.
Okay, just in time. So I will move the mic so I can stand on the X, which I think is how it's supposed to be. Also, okay, that works. Let me rearrange the stage a little bit. Hi, I'm Hank. As you know from the notebook, please always introduce yourself. That's really useful to people in the recording. I want to say next slide, please, but I can also use a clicker and I can also use slides. It's in the chair. It's in the chair slides, I think.
Yeah, it's a straight run through.
Yeah, and the NN is today, so just make that up by yourself. Okay, here we go. Status. This working group has documents, and these documents have status. And we are like, oh, thank you so much. I will test this, sorry. Wonderful, works. The clicker tool not always is as simple as it looks. So I'm Hank again. So this working group has documents, adopted documents, and related drafts that are not a document in this working group at all, actually. And let me start with, because I think we have ample time for that, that we are on light speed. I think from the optimal timeline to move drafts, and this is thanks to Deb to a significant extent, I think we lost 1.5 weeks from the optimal path of progressing slides, also slides, but drafts. So again? No, and that wasn't your fault, of course. Yeah, sometimes you have to react to things that are actually questions that you have to think a little bit about. But we are in a really, really good timeline here. So our main document, and we have chosen QR codes to reference them, is the SCITT architecture. We will not gloss over the recap as we did the last 1.5 years. I hope everybody has read them and is familiar with the document. It is in RFC Ed, thereby the RPC is churning on it. We then go from the left top side, from the working group drafts to the related drafts, because there's a strong dependency from the SCITT architecture to the Merkle tree proof ID, which is of course the file name and not the title of the ID. It is now Cozy Receipts. Cozy Receipts introduces two important things as the verifiable data structure algorithms and the verifiable data structure proof structures. These both provide the basis for the SCITT receipts that are basically a profile in the aforementioned architecture. The aforementioned architecture thereby is a standard text document, as it provides a specification, a normative specification to how to do signed statements and how to make those signed statements transparent. We've got an excellent, really useful feedback from the ISG. And the question was, why are you calling it a transparent statement if you could have called it a transparency statement? And I'm not going into the details of the discussion, but it's too late to do any changes in discussion on that. We are going with a transparent statement, and I think it's good enough. But I wanted to highlight and thank for that comment because it sparked a lot of discussions. But we will not change any terminology here at this point. So the SCITT architecture profiles the Cozy receipts. Again, they're called Merkle tree proofs here on the slide deck because that's a file name. Because at the beginning we just thought that this would be Merkle tree proofs, Merkle trees. can be more than that. And this is going on perfectly. I think this slide shows you where we are. The architecture actually is way ahead. It's depending on COSI receipts, which is also in, the RFC ads, so they're clustered. And this is the only dependency. So I think this cluster can move pretty fast. We have the COSI hash envelope, just as a reminder. If you just want to put something on the transparency servers that's already out there, and it's very big, or it's yours and you don't want to transfer it, hashing that and putting only the hash as the payload of the COSI envelope onto the transparency servers is, well, efficient. That's why we're doing that. There are other reasons why you want to do this, but I think that's the main one. And that also, I think, is pretty much crossing ISG ballot right now. I think there's one open item left that we have to deal with Diana based on Mike Bishop's input. Thank you for that. He's not in the room, of course, but I want to acknowledge that. So, which leaves the bottom left corner of this slide, which is a SCITT reference API, which has been implemented now, I think, multiple times. And there's some discussion on completeness. So what's going in, what's not going in. And we are pretty okay with what's going in. But if you just implement that, you'll not get a system where you can go to a transparency service and get all your SBOMs that you want. So there are the statement auxiliaries, we call them auxiliary services in the SCITT architecture. These endpoints are not defined. So if you want to go all the way through, there are a lot of more endpoints, so to speak, for the API. And do we all want to make them a reference implementation? We don't know. I don't think so. I think this set is complete. That is the final round of discussion before we move this to the ISG ballot. So I think that's I think topic for today also. Moving on. There have been substantial reviews here on the SCITT architecture, I think. Yeah, okay, yeah, it's the SCITT architecture actually. So we addressed several PRs and we moved a lot of versions ahead, but that is part of the ISG ballot, that is part of the IETF process. If you're in this phase, there will be a lot of version changes. And all of these have been basically accepted. So ISG was happy, we are in RPC. Scrappy is not as far. We are going for a working group last call, and I think the completeness discussion of the endpoints in the API is a good topic for working group last call feedback. We have did our work that was open, like there were PRs raised, issues raised. We did PRs on them, and we have a version of 5 submitted on the data tracker. If there is more concern about the scope or the usefulness of this reference API, now is the time, because it's in working group last call. Please speak up if you think you find nonsense or something that is important to you that's not in there. That is basically a reiteration of what I was just asking. What's missing for the Scrappy? The other things are already way ahead. And so we are not adopting any documents, not asking for any document adoption at this round, which does not mean that we do not have a lot of work to do. Just as a reminder, in SCITT, we register opaque bytes. My go-to example is a cat video. You can register that on the transparency servers, no questions asked. The thing is, sometimes all these statements that you register on the transparency servers are kind of interconnected, and you want to have a semantic interconnection between them. aka some graph, maybe a directed property graph or something. So where would that information go? Is it a non-opaque statement? I'm saying non-opaque statement because we are calling them transparent statement, and transparent statements have opaque payload. So do these transparent statements have non-opaque content that tell you where something goes? Is this a cozy header question? These are questions that are upcoming in this working group, and we don't really know, is this a SCITT working group question, or is it, for example, a SPICE question, where we do something about credential flows and how they are connected. So I think this is interesting discussions that can be on list, but I wanted to highlight them here already. And now I will not click. It worked so well. Does it find a slide? Yeah. Oh, and this is the find a slide, and therefore I can't click anymore. Are there any other questions from the room regarding the state of the union here in SCITT? As I hear crickets, I think I have drowned you in details that are way than enough, and will hand over to the next presenter. Right? Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Can you yes? Can you request control? Yeah.
Is that request slides or request screen share?
I would say I
Thank
couldn't
you.
find it in the list.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, there's somebody speaking, but I can't hear what they're saying. Should I request slides or not request slides?
No, you have control. You should be good.
I had control a minute ago, but I seem to have lost it. Sorry. Let me try again. It's working now. Thank you. Sorry. My name is Amory. I've been involved in the working group for a bit, also working on one of the implementations. And I want to talk about receipt profiles for a minute, if that's okay. So the SCITT architecture depends on cozy receipts, uses cozy receipts, as Henk explained. That's a profile of cozy. And so here's a couple of sections from the architecture document. Essentially, the document defines message structures for signed statements and transparent statements, which are cozy profiles. Those are defined in this cozy Merkle tree proofs document, which we call cozy receipts. And they're based on the cozy sign-on specification. That's in ST96. This cozy receipts document allows for profiles itself. And there's a section 4.4 that talks about this. And it says, like, if you define new verifiable data structures, they have different properties from the one that's proposed in the initial cozy receipts, then you need to register them. And the requirements are you must define an encoding, a way to produce them, and to verify them, which is quite reasonable. So cozy receipts define an RFC 9162 SHA-256 profile. That's done in section 5. It defines verifiable data structure, the inclusion proof, and the consistency proof layouts for this, how they're produced and how they can be verified. It's aimed at RFC 9162, as the name indicates, which was also called Certificate Transparency v2. It's a good example. It's vendor neutral. It's not really tied to any specific use case of SCITT, but it's also unfortunately not something, as far as I know, and do correct me if I'm wrong, but I did do a bit of research. It doesn't seem to have been something that was deployed anywhere so far, not for that purpose or for other purposes. However, there are 2 deployed cozy receipts implementation. They use different profiles that have a slightly different structure. So there's one that was built by Data Trails, which I believe the service name is called Forestry, but I'm not 100% sure. John can correct me if I'm wrong. And so there's a link to the implementation, the open source code that produces receipts for that profile. And there's also a Microsoft implementation, which has a slightly unfortunate name, SCITT CCF ledger will probably change, over time. That also produces receipts for a slightly different profile using cozy receipts. There's a first blog post that talks publicly about what's there. Is actually a second blog post came out yesterday. I did not make it in the slides, but I'll share it later. That explains more about what Microsoft is doing with this. And we verified interop between these profiles. We wrote verifiers, multiple verifiers that verified both profiles. And we showed that in Madrid and Hackathon last time. So there are existing verifier implementations that know how to consume both of those, but they're drafts at the moment. So Markov Mountain Range, that's the data trails profile. And it's based on a paper by Raisin and Yakubov. And essentially, the idea is you keep a bunch of subtrees which are always balanced, always full. And when you insert or you append to the tree, you sort of merge them in cascade to make sure that it's always a series of balanced trees. So you end up with a set of roots instead of more classically a single root to your tree. And so you end up, I think, having to sign, I think what Robin was calling snapshots, like a set of roots. It has certain benefits if you do things incrementally a certain way, but you do need to pay attention to what's being signed also to make sure that you have like a sort of consistent history of these subtrees. And then the CCF profile, which is the one that Microsoft implements, that's closer to 9162. It's a single tree. There's a single root, so it's not necessarily balanced. I mean, on average, it's not balanced. And the difference from 9162 or more usual trees is that there are more subleafs. That's because the system that was used to implement this transparency service has room for confidential information as well as public information. And so in some types of applications, you may have information that you do not want to disclose or that can't be disclosed to all parties on some transactions. So there needs to be space for not just the input document that you're making transparent, but also some additional information, which may or may not be public. It could be the governance of the ledger itself, or it could be other information that's application specific. For a TS, typically that's going to be pretty empty, but in general, it doesn't have to be. And then for governance transactions, you will have extra governance information that's not necessarily expressed in the TS itself that still needs to be there. There's also a mechanism for something called commit evidence. This is kind of a distributed system consensus optimization. If you want to persist things first and reveal commit later, you want to be able to do the signing process, disseminate the signatures, replicate them through consensus, but not have them be usable to produce receipts straight away. You can commit to something by taking a digest of it, and then you reveal the pre-image for the digest. And that's a way of doing these things. So you end up with 2 extra subleafs because of that. So the profile is a bit different from 9162 for these reasons, but it implements the same guarantees with a bit of extra functionality to work in these existing systems. So these 2 documents are there, and I think there's been some rounds of reviews already. Probably not as many as there should be, but essentially the call and the ask is to adopt these profiles in the SCITT working group because they're relevant to SCITT. They're used for transparency services implementations today, and they would really benefit from some additional reviews. The people who implement verifiers and who are consuming these receipts would really benefit from having these things be solidified and be final. So I would like to propose that this is adopted by this working group.
So speaking as chair, so I've read the CCF draft. I'm a little, I'm gonna acknowledge that Karsten is in the room. Are you not the chair of COSE? No, CBOR. Yeah, no. Okay. Right. So I didn't see something that I felt was so specific to the CCF draft that made it SCITT. And so I feel like it is another refinement of some of the COSE drafts, and I'm just looking to hear a version of trying to figure out why it belongs here as opposed to COSE, and or I'm willing to accept it if someone can kind of explain that, hey, it fits better in our charter versus theirs.
I mean, at the moment, this profile is used for SCITT. So, sorry, John, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I don't know if I have my chair hat on or not, but I'll speak as also participating member of the COSI working group, where I definitely didn't have a hat on. A couple of, maybe 3 IETFs ago now, these were proposed for adoption in COSI, and my recollection is that it was relatively well received, but the chairs wanted to see a bit more review before adopting, because only maybe 3 or 4 hands went up, and they wanted whatever 7 hands. So we could view this this slide in two halves. That it happens to be that the relevant implementations of this stuff are in SCITT at the moment, and people in this room and this virtual room reviewing these documents and giving them a thumbs up or some constructive criticism would help to get them adopted in either venue. Because I also fall largely on the side of, it would be better to adopt them in COSE, because then other working groups that are not strictly derivatives of SCITT would be able to use them. But I think the sticking point was getting sufficient review, and this room, regardless of where we eventually get it adopted, this room would be in a position to review, and also would benefit from providing those reviews such that we get them adopted. I think that's where we ended up here.
I mean, we can certainly do, call for some reviews. Can I get, well, let's do a quick show of hands. Yeah, but I'm going to use the tool.
If it helps, I did review them, and they're really quite digestible and easy to review. So it's
I have as well. It is not a long draft. It's not a huge lift for folks. But can I just get a kind of show of hands on how many people have reviewed this? Yeah, I'll give folks a moment to get into the into the tool. So I didn't put anything to the list. I can write up a review on the list.
So the question is, how many people have reviewed the CCF draft?
No. But the question right now is, I know I typed it probably way too fast. That's the problem with doing these on the fly. Have you read and you kind of done at least some nominal version, where I'm going to assume that if you have, you can put a review to the list rather quickly. It's a short draft. Have you read and consumed the CCF draft? Can you do a review? I'm asking here for have already read the draft.
So the question changed mid.
Well, I'm not closing it, so if you need to,
saying that some people have to read.
Yeah.
Change.
Is that unclear?
Yes.
It is the profile of this signature. Amory, what's the actual? Expand it for me, since.
It's called the CCF profile, I think. So you mean CCF? Sorry, CCF is the Confidential Consortium Framework. That's not super important in this context. It's just the name of the piece of software we use to implement the transparency service here.
Does anybody need any more time? I do have people in the queue. Oh yeah, I do. Nicole, go ahead. Oh, you're out. Ori?
Hi, Ori Steele. The to the question of like Cozy versus SCITT for this draft, when we created Cozy Receipts, which is sort of establishing the registries and allowing for these profiles to kind of come first, we did that in Cozy to make sure the registries were set up and everything was good. I think the intention has always been that with that work having been done in Cozy now, other working groups can use those registries without necessarily having all of that work have to go back to Cozy, right? We set up the registries so that they could easily be used. When we did SCITT architecture, we used some of the Cozy registries for new header parameters. So I think it makes sense that we could do this work in the SCITT working group, or indeed in any other working group that needed to register new Merkle tree structures could do that work in the group that's discussing those specific trees. And that last piece is the thing that I think is important. If we do this work here, I think we should make sure that these drafts identify what's unique and valuable about the CCF framework that isn't in the original Cozy Receipts draft. And I think the draft already kind of gets into that, but I would want to see more of that elaboration here in the context of, supply chain transparency. That's it.
Appreciate your comment. All right, Nicole, are you coming to Mike? Yeah, you're.
So I'm Nicole Bates. So one of the comments I also wanted to make is that the receipt profile here does tie into the implementation that SCITT addresses from the architecture spec. So I think it's really a relevant case that the work could occur here in the SCITT working group. Thank you.
All right, well, so my question was more of who's already read it. We got about 5 folks who have read it. If we could put some of those reviews to the list, and I will take, kind of some of those comments and put an adoption call to the list. I'm not. I don't know what my, I take Ori and Nicole's comments to heart, and I will confer with the AD when I have to make that call. But there's a reasonable chance to adopt this in SCITT. Emery, you're in queue.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to respond briefly to Ori's request, if that makes sense. Is this the right time to do that, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So one thing that is not done in the CCF profile, and part of the reason why I think this is specific to SCITT, is that it only talks about transparency. And so there's more to what you can do with CCF, which is to do with confidential information and selective reveal. It's a lot more complicated, and it would need a much more complicated profile than what's been proposed here, because this is only to do with public information and integrity about public information. So it's possible to do a more complex CCF profile that has a lot more to it, and that encapsulates the confidential aspects of it as well. And this is probably an interesting project too, but it's not if you scope things just to supply chain and to integrity use cases where you're making everything public, like you don't really need to do that. So this is partly why this is here and done like that. I'm happy to update the document in that direction if that helps.
I mean, to the extent that we're producing a profile that gets registered broadly, everyone can see the profile, even if it does come out of this working group. I think all of the capabilities and features of the profile should be adequately documented so that people don't reinvent work unnecessarily. So as a chair, I would like the most complete description of the thing that we are publishing as reasonable.
I understand that we're just trying to navigate a line, I guess, between making something that's very implementation specific and something that's more broadly applicable and that's not so tied to one particular implementation. Sorry, Ari.
Hi, Ori Steele. You said sort of public transparency, and I wanted to sort of pick at that. So I think what makes the CCF profile valuable is actually all of the stuff that it does that isn't just in the regular SHA-256 binary Merkle tree that you see in the regular CT logs. That are so there's this Merkle tree construction that is showing up over and over again. It shows up in CT. It's now showing up in the Merkle tree certs work. And that's the same binary Merkle tree, and it's a very simple binary Merkle tree. But CCF is adding features that are unique and valuable, and that go beyond those simple Merkle trees, like the one that we registered when we created the original registry. So I think that highlighting those differences is really important, and I think the idea that transparency is always public is also highly questionable. Like, we have a lot of open source software use cases where you'd expect to see a lot of transparency around all of the statements about a given, software artifact. But there are a lot of use cases where parts of the supply chain are protected or confidential or maybe highly restricted. There's, AI use cases where the training data that's going into the model needs to be carefully monitored, and you might not put all of that in a public transparency registry, but you still might want to be creating accountability where you can provide proofs that that documentation was registered according to a policy. So I think we should be careful not to think of SCITT as just for public transparency services, especially because that's a thing that can differentiate us from the regular CT logs and some of the other transparency use cases. So I'm especially in favor of documenting some of those sort of tie-ins to the confidentiality pieces in the context of the value they can bring to software supply chain, because I think that's super important. And if we have to talk a little bit about private transparency logs as part of that, I think that's also great. Thanks.
Emery?
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, and these are things that we would like to do and that we're discussing internally. To what extent they can be prioritized and we can do them next. We certainly love to do that in the future. The reality of it is that the things that are being pushed out now and shipped out now are mostly focused on public use cases. It doesn't mean that everybody can necessarily get access to the whole ledger, but the granularity or fine-grained reveal of receipt elements is not something that's in the foreseeable future for these implementations as they're standardized in SCITT. There are other internal systems that are not compliant with IETF standards or matching IETF standards. They'll probably get there, at some point. So yes, absolutely. I think that's something we want to look at, but also that's a kind of a feature request and something we'd like to do down the road. I don't want to be in a situation where we don't have interop and we don't have a standard for things just because, we think that we need to have extra features that we don't have implementations for or prioritization for in the near term. So we need to be careful also not to have the better be the enemy of good here. And I think if we can start with something that works today for what's shipping and existing and available, that's a really good thing. And then we can have an updated profile, a new profile for these new features, which requires some additional care and discussion, I would say.
All right. Anything else, or I'm moving the slide deck either way. Okay. Thank you, Emery.
Hi, I'm Nobuaki, and I will report on the news. It is discovered at the OCP Global Summit 3 weeks ago. it is very fresh. And my understanding is OCP is as one community with an interest in supply chain security. Its features include strengths in hardware and firmware and cloud. That OCP held the SCITT in high regard. Uh, the yellow and the big line represent the flow in which SCITT provides the supply chain information on the provenance of the OCP solution software or firmware. From our perspective and in SCITT, it can be achieved using the SCITT architecture and SCARPI. And this is what previous presenters have confirmed.
Can you focus on speaking into the mic a little more?
There. Yeah. And OCP site almost said, and it's worked well. It must be helpful news for SCITT. Yes, it gaining traction in community and outside the IETF as well. The simple size is small now, but time will solve these things. And OCP appears to have begun the exploring whether the same approach can be applied to the hardware, not just firmware, they said. And discuss on the element constructing provenance and HBOM has begun. And furthermore, they added the HBOM to the yellow line. And in the big picture, we discussed previous same. And whether the picture worked will be clear in next October. And we don't know. And considering the convenience of such use case as security measures, I think several challenges remain, but that's another discussion in this page. The execution result has not been made published, but the SCITT appear to have worked for OCP firmware use case. It is gratifying that SCITT architecture in the SCARPI has been matured. And let's some discussion. And for the first is can the application increasing that's variety of targeting statement in SCITT? I think it is probably yes. And second one is not either. So can we simultaneously provide the life cycle? For example, the provenance, and that's the software statement, and hierarchical information for the target system. And this is a point that required some refinement. And finally, and summarize to enhance the convenience and together with previous to draft. I think next action could be considered those. And if we create something draft, and it would be good to have a document and that's clearly explain who received benefit and who received those one without ambiguity. And I expect that's the solution to the three question, and that's our currently on hand right there. I I will try moving my hand for next 4 months. Thank you.
You're joining queue.
Yeah, hi, this is Hank. I think your 3 points at the end are the actual question. And sorry for my voice being breaking. This is my
Yeah.
several weeks of business travel. Um, what I think we are talking about here is associating statements. Statements are opaque to the SCITT ecosystem today, right? So there's the issue, there's a subject, sure, that's not opaque, but the content is. So now we started with the idea, and I think that was confusing to some reviewers actually, that we have a supply chain. And this supply chain will give us artifacts that are related. And a prominent example is this software bill of material or the vulnerability exchange format. There can be vulnerability disclosure reports, and there can even be, and that would require actually rechartering hardware where this is all running on. So at least we have software dependencies to build artifacts. These are typically trees. And we can't express those relationships with SCITT, obviously, because that SCITT is not responsible in its current form to associate those statements. Now, you're asking how to associate those statements, right? That's the core question. So that would be, I'm using a very weird term here. This is, I think I said this before, the non-opaque statement. You know what you're putting into the non-opaque transparent statement. You know what you are putting into the registry, into the append-only log, and can make sense out of it without an external auxiliary service. So there are, I think, two places to put this, potential places to put this. It could be in the cozy header. There could be hints how a statement refers to a statement, right? Because the signed part of the cozy header is up for scraps. It's not the statement itself, and we can specify something there. So it could be an extension point to refer to another statement that has been registered. So there's a transparent statement. That's one option to do it. Then, if you look on a larger scale, there's also the SPICE working group that just introduced the Global Unique Enterprise Identifier. But it's working with it, they're not just introducing it. So they also want to point to certain artifacts, and there are use cases in SPICE that will include how avionic airport systems work and how to associate that statements. So that would be in the statement part, right? That would not be in the cozy header part. That would be a specific type of statement. And the specification probably would say these statements are not as opaque as the others. You should understand them if you claim to be about this topic and relate them so they can create graphs. So I think there are multiple ways to do this. And I think I highlighted two options that are coming to my mind. And the question now is, what does the working group think about that? Is it an interesting topic for the working group? Because we have in the charter the topic to address the supply chain software security use case. And I think by just making statement transparent and leaving the rest to who know what is maybe not enough. right? We have the Scrappy to get all the receipts, for example, and check for inclusion proofs, sorry, consistency proofs and such. But we can't really associate a SBOM with the VEX or with the VDR. And these are very simple use cases that I think are in scope of the charter. And we really have to just agree on the right place to do them. And I'm not averse doing them in SPICE as a statement format and some frosting here in SCITT to put them to register them in the append only log. But I think yeah, we have to decide on a way to move forward. And I think it's a good idea to do that because it's literally in the charter.
Thank you for comment.
Hi, Ori Steele. The thing that Hank said about the headers. So I think I think you all know, in order to register anything in a SCITT transparency service, you have to wrap it in Cozy Sign 1. You can put many identifiers in the CWT claims and headers, and you can build information graphs, labeled property graphs, just from indexing only the header parameters and completely ignoring the payload. If you understand the payload, you can then build a more detailed graph for payloads that you understand for each content format you understand. So if you understand an SPDX SBOM, you can build a graph just looking at the header, and then you can build a graph connected to that graph that's the SPDX SBOM format underneath it. Scrappy does not give you really any APIs for looking at these graphs, retrieving them, finding all of the, it's not a graph query API. It's a register my signed statement, get me a receipt API. In the implementation that I did before, like during the working group last call for Scrappy, I implemented all the graph stuff because you kind of want all the graph stuff. So my implementation has a bunch of indexing JSON, retrieval APIs for getting out pieces of the graph based on what you've registered by only looking at the protected headers. The reason I say all of this is it's all material to like what you actually think you need to do to finish Scrappy. So if you think Scrappy should just ship as only register signed statements and return receipts, then no changes are necessary. If you want to add all this graph query stuff to Scrappy, it will take a lot longer to finish Scrappy. That's my comment.
Thank you.
Emery?
Yeah, I think something we've discussed with Hank before, and that's connected. I've made a lot of progress on this, but I would like to look at, we use SPDX a lot internally, and one of the difficulties we have with it is it doesn't have a deterministic encoding. And so we would like to look at having a deterministic encoding for SPDX that would be CBOR based, that would be a good fit for SCITT, and which we think would be a good basis to build stuff like graph queries and so on in a standard way. I will say that this is probably some time away, and so holding up the existing Scrappy work and the existing level of interop that we've already shown before until this is complete, I think is probably not the right trade-off to make. That's just my opinion, but it is something that we would like to look at. This is something that Microsoft is interested in looking at.
Hi, this is Hank. This sounds to me like a typical case of you can do one thing and also not omit the other. We could release Scrappy as is and add endpoints later. They do not conflict, right? So there's a native extension point, so to speak, in REST APIs. You just add more endpoints here. And maybe that's the way forward. So we could ship Scrappy as is as a registry API, and then add the auxiliary services that Ori. Thank you for implementing that. I think there are more endpoints about graph discovery than registry, and add those later and a updating RFC. Sorry for ID in the end. So I think I agree with Amory, and in the interest of time, we should move Scrappy as is, but could immediately start working on use cases for these graphs and what requirements they impose on the first of all API. That's another topic I didn't talk about earlier, and the data structures that we register.
Can I ask a clarifying question of you, Ori, which is with your graph additions, was that purely extension to Scrappy as defined, or did that require any change or modification to the defined endpoints?
Ori Steele, I put the links in the chat to the implementation, the message I sent to the list, and the API definition. And these are the SCITT Scrappy is one section of the API definition, and then underneath it is the endpoints that I added. So it's no changes to anything in Scrappy. It's just an additional set of endpoints. And the key part of those additional endpoints is that I actually use JSON instead of CBOR for them, because the query interface is meant to be kind of human readable. And so it made sense to make the query retrieval piece of that JSON to be a little bit more comfortable. You know, for example, if you ask an agent to crawl your supply chain graph, it's nice for the agent to be able to just read the JSON back out and summarize your supply chain results. That's it.
So, as chair, if I ask the working group, kind of, we've done a lot of conversation about Scrappy. Ori, maybe what you just described is some kind of software extension onto, kind of what the presentation was that, would people view that as a hardware profile if you have a software profile for what you just described? Or I'm struggling to understand exactly what I understand the conversation, but I don't know where we're headed. No. It was like kind of an open, I heard the conversation, and, well, we had a nice presentation about hardware, kind of bombs and security as it relates. We had a good conversation about what the Scrappy API is now and what it means for software. But the presentation was really, can we do hardware here? And kind of the question for me becomes a little bit: are we proposing that we lock Scrappy in as is, and then maybe there's a software profile that adds more endpoints? Correspondingly, does that conversation imply that there's a profile that's hardware endpoints that get added? And that's a recharter question as well. But
Hi, Ori Steele. I think the mistake we made at the beginning of all this was saying SCITT was just focused only on software. We're talking about signed graph structures that are about the production of an end product from intermediate ingredients, and statements about those intermediate ingredients and those end products and the way that they were produced. And the graph data model doesn't care whether you're talking about a software artifact or hardware artifact. Indeed, all of the use cases that I've ever wanted to work on regarding SCITT are all about physical supply chain transparency and traceability. I think the question you're asking is whether we in this group need to talk about graph query, graph retrieval APIs that are sort of tangent to SCITT, maybe in the context of the header parameters. And I think that's a great question. There are other graph sort of tools out there like Guac that help you explore software supply chain graphs, for example. For me, the graph data structure is fundamental to supply chain transparency, regardless of whether your supply chain is about software or avocados. That's it.
Thanks. Amory?
I'm aware of Quorum for hardware, which is these reference manifests that describe hardware measurements, which I think is not a million miles away from what we're discussing here. So if you have information about hardware, it can be captured in a quorum that can be quasi-signed. this was a little incompatible with SCITT in the past because of the way the issuer and so on was captured, but we've made some changes there, and now it lines up so you can make quorum reference manifest transparent in SCITT transparency services, and it's sort of CBOR all the way down, and it's really usable for graph type queries, or it should be, I claim, in theory. I've not done this. So I don't know if that's a direction to explore for hardware. Obviously, the question is, I guess, if we have a number of different formats for hardware and for software, do we try to establish an abstraction over all of them to make it possible for someone to query all of them in a uniform way? That seems difficult. There's not very unified fields so far. People are defining new formats. So it's likely that whatever we do needs to be able to deal with different formats, I guess. But yeah, quorum comes to mind as something that should probably be taken into account for hardware.
I think this is a question to take to list. We're not going to resolve it now, but I think we do need to kind of come up with what our thought is on that. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Chris, do I have slide control here?
I mean, you should your chair, so.
Yeah, I should, but I can't see them anywhere.
Hold on, I'll add it. No,
Yeah.
oh, she beat
There
me
we
to
go.
it.
Yeah.
I was
There
just
you
about to click yes.
Yeah, I'm not even at my own home at the moment, so yeah, things don't work the way they should. So good. So that thank you very much, Aoki-san, for that presentation and the debate that it started. This is also a use case presentation intended to sort of inspire similar comment and see what we want to do about what's previously been called sort of auxiliary services or ancillary services, external services. It's had many names, but yeah, looking into this question of whether we're done or whether there's more work products to be done for these use cases. As I mentioned at the beginning, unfortunately Dick can't be here now, but many thanks to Dick Brooks for putting these slides together and bringing the use case. And this is really an evolution of what was shown back at IETF 117 and 118 in the hackathons, just with some evolved understanding of both the requirements and where SCITT has got to. So I've agreed to present on Dick's behalf. I'm not nearly as knowledgeable as he is on the details behind the slides, so do take things to the list. But we thought it would be worth just going through this use case and looking at those same gaps and seeing if the charter's right, if the current state is right, or if there's some more work to be done. So this is the Food and Drug Administration, which has quite a lot of interest in making sure that supply chains are well documented and traceable for all kinds of stuff. But of course, their remit, for anyone who doesn't know or doesn't live in a jurisdiction where they have power, there's quite a lot more than just food and drugs. There's also medical devices. There's also software that administers things and all sorts of other stuff that they look after. So they've got a significant interest in both hardware and software supply chain. And indeed, by the way that the regulations are written, it's kind of hard to separate the two as well, because if you've got a device, well, that is hardware and software, and it doesn't really matter which part of that fails. If it fails, you need to get to the root of the problem. So it's a good use case to look at that overlap and again that question of whether the charter is relevant. So we've got the links here. Of course, the slides are published, so go ahead and check the links at your leisure. But essentially, the final guidelines, they include lots and lots of stuff, as they always do, beyond this. But there's also the SBOM work. We've already heard some stuff about SBOMs today, and cybersecurity labels, which is something it's quite common and popular in the US and in Europe. I don't know if it's popular in Asia, but the idea of labeling things because it's no good that somebody once checked the security of something. It's also kind of important to publish some way of the users or the people liable to these failures to be able to look up that information and make their own risk judgments. And so that's what labeling is for. And many of you will know that for quite some time, Dick has been quite doggedly following this use case and keeping updated with SCITT to implement this kind of transparency and traceability of the security properties of these relevant devices and software with SCITT. So a couple of relevant bits of the labeling requirements. One thing is looking at device labeling and manufacturer vulnerability management plans. And one thing that's important to note, of course, is that certainly in the UK and Europe, when this started, which I'm personally much more familiar with, labeling actually meant labeling. When it first came out, they were talking about putting a little QR code on the side of your toothbrush, for example, having a very visible thing, or maybe a label on the outer box that gives you insight into the cybersecurity and the vulnerability management, the vulnerability status of anything that you're using. Now, of course, when you're talking about something like an SBOM and you're talking about things that change over time and you're talking about something that might sit on the shelf for 18 months before it's sold, clearly a label on the side of a box is not going to tell you everything you need to know. So the important thing about this is that it's kind of an entry point into the transparency. It's not that you have to have everything one and done and finished and published. And so this idea of the linkability, the graph of related claims and so on, that becomes interesting. And the other important part of this, which is important, is notification. And of course, notification again is something which evolves, because you can have a static property of a device. It might have version 3.1 of a piece of software, but when they ship that, it was deemed fine. And then 6 months later, it will be deemed very much not fine. Well, that fact and the SBOM and even a transparent statement that that's what was in the SBOM will not have changed, but the relevant understanding of the security context of the thing will have changed. And so again, there's a need for quite rich, quite large, and quite dynamic information to be made transparent in an interoperable way that doesn't kind of bust the banks or require you to have a 60-page manual for your toothbrush, which is FedExed to you fresh every month when they redo their software composition. So these are the kind of things that that are in the regulations, which kind of suggest that you need a versatile and updatable way of getting all this information out to the users and the people who will actually be liable to failures of these things. So as a small upgrade, you may remember, some of you will remember from, gosh, IETF 119, I'm going to say, I think it was the one where the vendor registration form was proven. So we took this thing, which was the transparency statement at the time, was that the vendor fills in a form and they put in the relevant information about their suppliers, and they make promises that their suppliers are good and have been vetted and have SOC 2 and whatever else. We managed to sort of show transparent statements on that VRF, and that's still a thing that people might do. And of course, you could do exactly the same thing with an SBOM, and you could do exactly the same thing with an HBOM. But what Dick is now proposing here is actually kind of enveloping all of that into a trusted location where you can just publish that information and keep it updated, but keep it updated in a way that is still transparent, so that you can't lie about it, you can't change it later and things like that. So the idea is to keep the same sort of use case, this cybersecurity labeling with the FDA regulations, but use the fact that these are rendered transparent in SCITT transparent statements to make sure those URLs are actually kind of quote unquote trustworthy. And you can argue about what trustworthy means, but certainly making it non-reputable, making it untamperable, and having opportunities for that most favorite of properties, the non-equivocation, that certainly really helps an awful lot versus just having like a web URL or something like that. And being able to do this in a very solid and cryptographically checked way, and in a small form factor that allows you to distribute it and double check it, also makes it easy to avoid things like typo squatting, so that people can't, there's multiple threats here, and one is that the vendor is dishonest and kind of changes their mind or changes their statements, but others are that malicious actors could put fakes up that are convincing fakes. I see you in the queue, Eric. I'll do one more slide and then let you in, because this is an important thing. So the basic idea to this, and it's really put up as a litmus test to say, well, is this implementable and does it work for this use case with the status of the specs and the drafts as they are today, is essentially to have this URL where all of this information is posted, potentially also with hashes of the documents. This is a thing that just adds complexity, and it begs this question about the graph again, if you need to sort of link all these things together with some sort of version field or something like that. But it seems like a very reasonable way to do this and to register with the authorities where you are publishing all this stuff, so that they can verify that indeed you are publishing this stuff, by putting your canonical URL into a statement, signing it with your issuer key, submitting it to the transparency service, and then having that be the anchor for this labeling that serves as the entry point for people to be able to read that information. So they've got a single, very small piece of information that gives them a trustworthy gateway from which they can then read a URL. They go to the URL, they fetch the stuff, and then they can iterate from there. And of course, everything like the SBOMs and the HBOMs and the VRFs could have their own transparent statements against them. And there you go. So the supposition is it seems like it already works with SCITT as it is, but again, the big question where we've got this this mystery cloud thing and the trust registry that's mentioned in the topic, the big question that's begged is, well, do we actually need to have something like this linkability attribute that allows you to make a graph of related statements in order to do this properly, or is it fine to have them all floating and separate? So I'm sure Dick would have done a much better job of presenting it than I have, but the question really begged is the same, is to just spur the imagination and make sure that we think we we can be missing stuff. I think I would agree with Henk, with my chair hat on and off, I would agree with Henk that we can go now and still add stuff later. That's not a problem, but just make sure that this kind of use case, which is very squarely within the realms of kind of required scope, actually works with what we've got, or whether there's something else we need to add before we close off. And with that, Eric, I think if you want to be first back in queue, please ask your question. Or maybe David.
Hi, David Rogers. So I'm the author of the UK's Code of Practice on IoT Security, which became EN 303645, will be part of the basis for CRA. So I just wanted to support the views that you were saying there about this being a kind of gateway to the information about the software state and so on. This is exactly the thinking that we were looking at as some kind of labeling scheme in the UK. That didn't actually pass through. The UK doesn't have a labeling scheme for lots of reasons. But I think there are many of us that still believe that for IoT, this will be the way forward for the future, and exposing the capabilities and information about the devices will help in multiple ways in different sectors. So I fully support this.
Great, thanks, David. Cool, that sounds good. So I'm not seeing anyone else in the queue. So again, the only thing I would stress on this is, it seems sensible. It seems like it works, and Scrappy is in last call. So the only thing to really focus on is, if we think Scrappy's ready to do this, which I think, with certain additions like Ori's pointed out, I personally think it's in good shape, but I'm not the most appropriate person to say things like that. So do review it, take a look, make sure you're happy, and then we can look at whether we need to extend scope or not, and add endpoints or not, in order to reach what Dick's asking for, and what David was just reiterating.
Okay, we've entered the all other business. What was the other? What was your other acronym on that, John?
Oh, I can't remember now. Any other business and
Slack.
Oh, Slack. Well, that's not an acronym. That's just we've got
That's right.
some Slack time.
Working group, I raised the hand in the wrong room. I hope they call it. Oh, this is really, I don't know how to fix this. So this is Hank. Hi. So we've been dancing around that issue for, I think, 2 meetings now. Where do semantics go? And could we, I don't know, could we do a call in the room where people would like, so under the assumption that we want to associate statements, where should that association happen? Should it happen in the COSI header that we already specify? So it's more on the SCITT side of things, or should it happen on the statement side in a, I want to say, steered manner, so it's on the application side a little bit? I think that's an important decision to make, and I do not know how to make that decision. So my question to the chairs is this worth a call? Should these semantics, how to associate statements, go into the envelope that we register and specify in SCITT, the COSI sign 1, or should it go into the non-opaque statements and define them, which does not necessarily only happen to be here in SCITT, but it can also happen in other working groups, like Recon or something, who also want to maybe associate their statements on a append-only log. I think we are always like coming to the same question, but I would like to ask, can we kind of attempt to answer that question?
Can I give you like the snarky? So are you saying now that we've settled on transparency statements, you want to be non-transparent?
First of all payloads of transparent statements are opaque. Haha. So, which means SCITT doesn't care what you register. You register bytes. So one approach.
It was snark.
Oh, that was just a snark. Okay,
It's just
sorry. Yeah, I'm too tired maybe to get that.
I'm not sure how to phrase that question to the room, to be perfectly honest, to do the poll. At least not without it being a paragraph long.
Is it COSI? Is it in the COSI envelope, or should it be in the statement? I mean, are there any other options? Please raise your hand and come to the mic if there are other options. There are other people in the queue, so I will just stop for now. I think there's a 3, right?
Hi, Ori Steele. For the people who are never going to sign their artifacts or statements or non-opaque statements with COSI, they build the graphs based on the content formats, media types they're using for this today. So I think the the general comment I would make is that if you're doing forensic analysis, you're going to start by looking at all of those individual formats, and you're going to build a graph that's actually only focused on the payloads, and you're not going to think about SCITT at all. And then at some point, there's going to be this moment where you might hope that some of those things were registered in a transparency service. And if they were, there's an additional graph with additional verification that you might find that connects into that. But for example, like as was pointed out, a lot of the RATs, formats have these graphs already embedded in them in RATs, and the folks with RATs are getting along fine with building graphs without the SCITT, header layer as part of building the graph. So to the question of like, where should they be? I mean, they're already in the payload formats today. And for the folks who adopt SCITT, they get an additional graph on top. That's the answer to that question, I think. And that's it.
Yes.
Okay, I was actually coming to roughly the same kind of conclusion what Ori just suggested. I mean, we as architects should not restrain to a particular model. So say that no, this relationship only happens in the payload. I think we have a flexible architecture here with SCITT that you can have that intelligence baked into the header as well. So the relations in the payload are already addressed as Ori suggested in other standards. So SCITT provides a layer of addition by introducing some kind of relations through the headers, issuer or whatever subject and stuff like that. So I think we would leave the other aspects of payload out of the scope for now, and we should just focus that do we have enough information in our COSE sign 1 header claims to build that relations to make it a complete document. Yeah.
Emery?
Yeah, I agree with Yogesh. I think also that there is quite a wide variety of documents you can have inside SCITT, and they all have their own different semantics for how they can link to each other. It's really not impossible to find out like a superset of all these semantics, but it's going to be quite complex, and it's going to make the headers really large potentially. Or we would need to focus on a small set of formats and implement something that only works with these formats. So I think it's great to experiment, but it's not clear that we can do something that's one size fits all here. And I mean, disclosing a personal bias for smaller modular things and layering, I think I would prefer to see SCITT stay relatively simple and leave it to the formats to define their own semantic relationships, and say that if you have a sufficiently wide diversity of formats, then it may be difficult to understand all the relationships between these things. But that's what you decide to do for a given TS or not for a given TS. Trying to define something that captures what all the HBOMs and SBOM formats out there provide and can expose all these subtleties is going to be very difficult, I would say.
Yeah, so this is Hank, and I agree with Amory. You can't capture all the semantic relationships between all the diverse formats of cat videos. That is impossible. They probably have a gazillion relationships. And so that's not the point. But in the scope of the software and potential hardware supply chain, I think a minimal set of abstract relationships can help as a guidance if you are really unwilling to delve into the different formats. Imagine all the S-bombs are in Cyclone DX and all the VEXs are in ACE and 1 X509 certificates. It's just a weird example. I understand that. But nobody will ever be able to correlate that with a machine that is not absolutely weirdly specific. But you can at least have some supersedes, replaces, augments, the standard relationships that we've learned over the last decade or longer even from examples like ISO, SCITT, or from the SPDX domain, which has only a few of relationships actually that relate to how to deal with updates and extensions of statements, and maybe a mix of those. And my gut feeling would be like, this can't be more than 10, never. Would be helpful for a system that is not able to understand the payload, but is really required to retrieve it for its handlers, so to hand off all that without going into the detail of every statement, especially if the transparency service does not have an auxiliary service, or whatever you call it, that stores all these statements. You just want to have the receipts for that. And you want to find and then discover them. And then the machine kicks in. And that is impossible to do. You just would have to proactively to scrape everything that's somehow there. That doesn't scale. So I assume that a core set of semantics in the header, and then whatever the content does in its complexity in combination, I think that is what I heard, I think 2 times already on the mic, is a good approach. At least a good experiment. I think that's what you said, Anne-Marie. Right? Yeah.
Great. So thanks, Hank. I think I agree with everybody. We're not looking to sway the group in any particular direction on the main use case, but just to point out, and again, in terms of keeping things achievable, there are 2 very different pieces of work there. And I think what you just described, Hank, is something slightly different, which is not necessarily linking of X with an SBOM, and all the many variants of that, which are also interesting, but have a lot of different working groups where that could happen, and different ways that can happen, and all sorts of other stuff. But actually, it's more interesting when you want to say, well, a receipt can't really be rescinded. Once someone's got a receipt in their hands, they can verify it, and it verifies, and it's true, right? So thinking back about this idea that you have a gateway to the information you want, or the QR code on your toothbrush and things, that sounds to me like a slightly different scope of work, which is to say, well, I did absolutely make this statement, but it's no longer valid, and actually you should look over here for the one that replaces it. And a silly example, we know, but it's just the easiest one to understand. It's like my latest SBOM, right? This was my latest SBOM at some point. It's not anymore. That's the sort of thing that a supersedes might do. But I think it's very, very different to consider metadata talking about a transparent statement, or talking about a receipt, as in talking about the evolution of objects which are specifically SCITT, as different from talking about this opaque thing that lives in the payload that could have any of a million different formats and semantic interpretation. So just to I guess caution the group, or salve my own internal torment, not to try to solve both of those with the same mechanism, because they're not solving the same problem.
I'm happy to give you the 2 minutes back.
2 minutes slack. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Have a good IETF. Thank you for taking notes. I appreciate it very much. I will go through. So they are very extensive. Thank you, Nicole.